Hello. So, uh, cognitive treatments for depression. Uh, Hopefully, you've looked at the YouTube or the video going through cognitive explanation. So, you're looking at Beck's negative triad. You're looking at Ellis's ABC model. Uh, Today, we're going to be looking at CBT, which is a cognitive way of treating depression. Now, again, as I explained in the last video, are there biological treatments for depression? Yes, antidepressants. Are there humanistic treatments for depression? Yes, therapy. So there's multiple different ways to treat depression. We are solely going to be looking at it from a cognitive point of view, and that is CBT, is what we're going to be looking at, cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of CBT. Some of you would have undergone CBT. Um, it's a hell of a lot of hard work. It doesn't tend to be that successful in teenagers because it does take a lot of hard work. And at that age, a lot of teenagers don't want to put the work in. Not all teenagers, but a lot of teenagers want a bit more, instant results. But there's a lot to it. So what's quite important to note here is I'm going to try go through the cognitive treatment of depression. So we're going to be looking at how CBT specifically treats depression. Now, if I come off this and I go to here and I type in CBT, right, and I go to the NHS's website and click on the CBT bit. Brilliant. My internet's doing my flipping head in right now. I'm just going to try this once, otherwise I'm going to freak out. Right. I'm going to freak out. Try it yourself. Basically, what I'm trying to say is CBT fixes a hell of a lot of things. So, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, it can have a big impact on. It can even treat things like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, or fibromyalgia, right? It does have many, many applications. What I'm trying to say here is you need to know how CBT specifically treats depression. So, if you get any questions on anything to do in this bullet point, you have to make sure you are linking it to depression. So let's just have a brief recap here and go through why we have depression in the first place from a cognitive point of view. It is about maladaptive thinking, maladaptive being something that doesn't fit normally into society, right? So this is thinking that it isn't normal, right? It isn't functional, it doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. And it says here that cognitive behavioral therapy suggests psychological problems arise from individuals having a faulty way of thinking. Now, the problem only exists in the way a person thinks about their problem, not the problem itself. So, people don't go to people don't go to therapy because of their problems. That's what CBT basically thinks. People go to therapy because their problems have caused them to think in a faulty way. And if you fix that faulty way, you're going to get that person, that client, in a better position to be able to take care of their own therapy. So the key part of any CBT, as it says here, in order to treat such disorders, a client needs to be challenged and needs to be able to identify their irrational thoughts. So a question I just want to kind of throw out to you, I guess, is do you think that every thought that comes into your head makes perfect sense and is based in reality? The truth is, everyone automatically thinks everything they think is rational, it makes sense, it's logical, it's correct, right? You would not believe how much irrational thinking you do on a daily basis. It's mostly things about yourself. So, for example, if I were to get you to describe yourself, how you would describe yourself in your head, most of that's probably going to be quite irrational. You're going to be like, oh, well, I've got shit eyebrows. Like, your eyebrows aren't shit. That's just a a prejudice, self-prejudice you have against yourself. So we actually do have a lot of irrational thinking. Now, most of it, by the way, just so you're clear, most of your irrational thinking is not actually that harmful. But if you're having more irrational thinking than rational thinking, and some of you can be more irrational than rational, you're probably looking at having some sort of depression type disorder, I would say. Remember, depression is a thought disorder more than anything. There is an emotional part to it, but depression is mostly a thought disorder. So CBT aims to try to identify your negative irrational thoughts. And this is what I kind of like an optional homework. I want you to try catch an irrational thought of yours. I want you over the next couple of days, maybe before your lesson, if you haven't had it already, for you to be able to identify a thought of yours that initially you think is correct, but the more you think about it, the more you actually realize, I'm not actually sure that is true. You will find it incredibly difficult. And this is why people go to therapy, is to be able to identify your irrational thoughts better. So when you've got a depressed person, for example, who thinks, I'm ugly, I'm ugly, I'm ugly, which again is irrational, by the way. That's literally not a rational thought. Or I'm worthless, for example, or nobody likes me. You need to be able to train the depressed individual to be able to identify that's a rational thought. Take a step back and think, well, actually, no, there isn't any evidence that I'm ugly. There isn't actually any concrete evidence that nobody dislikes me. It's just my opinion, and I'm clearly wrong here. So therapy is really, really good at promoting, and again, note this down, a positive and rational way of thinking. CBT includes both cognitive and behavioural. So not only does it work on your behaviours, how to behave in certain situations and train you how to behave in certain situations, but it also allows you to be able to be trained how to think in certain situations. And I'm going to bring up gambling addiction a little bit here because it can be quite useful here, I think. But we're going to be mainly looking at this from a depression point of view. Let's start with the cognitive element. Training people to be, I'm going to try and link this as much as I can to depression, but training people to be aware of their beliefs, right? So the therapist encourages the client to become aware of beliefs which contribute to anxiety or depression. Let's stick with depression. So a therapist might say, what do you think is a trigger for your depression? What may you think when you are in one of those low moods, for example, and can't get out of bed? A therapist will ask you, when you're in bed and you can't get out of bed, because some people who suffer with depression do find it very, very hard to get out of bed because they don't see the point in getting up. A therapist might then say, well, what are you thinking at that point? Right? They want to be able to identify what thoughts are irrational and what is irrational. There is something important that I definitely want you to write down. I don't know if it's in your workbook, or I don't know if it's in this slide later on. The therapist will treat anything the client says as a hypothesis. So a depressed individual who goes to their friend and says, look, friend, I think I'm worthless. All their friend is going to do is go, and by the way, this worthlessness is deep in the depressed individual, right? They believe it's one of their core beliefs, it's really, really deep down. And they go, look, friend, I feel I'm worthless. Oh, and the friend goes, no, you're not. No, you're not. The depressed individual is hardly going to turn around and go, you know what? Yeah, actually, you're completely right. Actually, I'm worth full if anything. So a therapist will not do that. A therapist will not go, no, you're not. You're a beautiful human. The therapist isn't going to do that for many reasons. But instead, the therapist is going to treat what the client says as a hypothesis and say, okay, well, you say you're worthless. You say you think you're worthless. Tell me why. Right? And all the therapist is going to do is try get, and again, this is really important, so again, definitely note this down, is not try to convince the depressed person that they aren't worthless. It's to make the client realize themselves that they are not worthless. So let me go into this a bit more, right? So the client will do some direct questioning. Tell me what you think about other people with depression. Tell me what you think about your self-worth. Tell me what you think about your prospects for the future, for example. And again, I'm sorry, it does say it here. The therapist does not comment upon the client's beliefs, does not say, oh, no, you're wrong, you're beautiful, you're not a worthless person. Doesn't say that. Instead, it treats it as a hypothesis and examines it for validity. So then I'm not asking you to do CBT with your friends, but the next time your friend comes up to you and says, look, I feel everyone hates me. Don't just go, no, they don't. No, they don't, because you're not going to convince them. You're not going to convince them. They say, oh, well, tell me why you think everyone hates you. Tell me why you think everyone hates. Tell me why everyone thinks. Tell me why you think that you're an unattractive person. Tell me why you think that you're going to fail, right? So again, a good example here. Someone with depression will automatically think they're going to fail the course, and I've had it so many times where somebody's come up to me and be like, "I'm going to fail," and if I go, "No, you're not," again, they're not going to turn around and say, yeah, Kieran, you know what, you're right, you've completely convinced me. So provide them with maybe concrete evidence. Anyway, what we're going to be looking at is the ABCDE model. Right? It's pretty simple, really, to be honest. A little bit like ABC model for LS, but we're going to be going through that in a second. I do want to go through the behavioural element here. So this is the cognitive element. The behavioural element is more what we call reality testing. So the therapist and the client decide together how the client's beliefs can be reality tested through experimentation, either through role play or homework assignments. So when the therapist trains the client to act in a certain way, they are deciding how they were going to go about doing that through behavior. So the aim is testing out possibilities. Clients will themselves come to recognize the consequences of their own faulty cognitions. And basically, there's a lot of goal setting. So, for example, if a depressed individual cannot get out of bed, the therapist will go through a person's thoughts with how they struggle getting out of bed, and they will discuss it between them. What the therapist will do is kind of try to test them to see how they would react in the future. Right, I'm describing this terribly because it's an incredibly hot day today, and I played 3 hours of tennis, and I'm really struggling in this heat. Anyway, let's move on. These usually in graded stages of difficulty. So, for example, they will do role plays. The client and the therapist will do role plays, and they will pretend that they've got a situation where the client can't get out of bed, and basically the client will say, "Right, this is what I think. Right, I'm not going to get out of bed because I am worthless, and there's no point in going into college, and there's no point because I'm going to fail anyway." So then the therapist will just try to keep challenging those thoughts. Why do you think you're going to fail? Right? Okay. What's the first smallest step that you can do to start getting yourself out of bed? Right. And I want you to practice that. And that's what that means when it says about homework assignments. Just at the top here, the therapist will set homework assignments, and they are usually ways to behave if they can feel the depression coming on, to train yourself to behave in certain ways. So there's a cognitive element here, there's a behavioural element. I've described it absolutely awful. So I do want to go through the ABCDE model. This may not be in your workbook. I don't think D or E is in your workbook. But again, it's quite similar to the ABC model that Ellis come up with. You've got an activating event, for example. So Linda, you don't get many Lindas nowadays, do you? Linda gets a low mark in her mocks for A-level psychology. Remember, the activating event you have no control over, so we don't need to pay any attention. Your beliefs are what cause your irrational depression to emerge. So on one hand, you've got more rational thoughts, for example. Now again, just think, are you as rational as you can be? No, you're not. particularly, by the way, particularly with your A-levels. Most students are completely irrational, are not grounded in reality. Most students think they're going to do worse than they actually will. So most students think that they're going to get a D when they're actually running at a B. It's a protection thing, basically. You do get the odd student that's the opposite way, that genuinely thinks they are going to get an A star, despite the fact that they hadn't even achieved anything higher than a B at this point. But yeah, anyway, you've got rational thoughts or you've got irrational thoughts, and these are going to lead to either desirable emotions or behavior, or undesirable emotions and behavior. So, for example, if Linda tells herself that her thoughts, oh my, I need to change that. Linda tells herself that she thought she could have done better, but did not put in enough revision, and that, you know, if she were to do revision next time, then yes, she's going to feel disappointed, but she's going to resolve to put more in. That's going to lead to better consequences. So it's the belief you hold about the event. What CBT does is it tries to dispute these beliefs if they are irrational, right? Which is pretty much what I've said so far, okay? So by this stage, the individual should have an understanding of what triggers them, okay? They should know. It's been identified by the therapist in this case. The next stage of this model is for the therapist to help challenge with the ultimate goal of replacing it. Not only, by the way, and again, this is quite important, I keep saying that, but not only is this important, the therapist is trying to make the client self-sufficient in identifying their irrational thoughts. The therapist is not always going to be around. So the therapist wants to train the client to be able to actually identify their own irrational thoughts and then replace it with better beliefs, more healthy, rational beliefs. So questions that a therapist may ask at this stage: how are your beliefs serving you? Do your beliefs help you? What would happen if you had different beliefs? How would different... So again, they're quite direct. I want you to have a look at these questions actually down here. They're quite direct. They are confrontational without being aggressive. They are forcing the client into an answer and to give them the honest opinion. They're open questions, so they're not closed questions. Right? Apart from, do your beliefs help you? Yes, no. What would happen if you had different beliefs? So basically, you're going to get a lot of qualitative data from this, from which you'll be able to actually help it. Once you've disputed these, you want to replace it with an E, effective new approach. So the last stage of this model involves the therapist working with the individual to replace them with a new set. So questions that you may ask at this stage: what's the rational truth in this situation? By the way, that's a really, really good stage to be at in therapy. When you are depressed, you don't know why you're depressed. You don't know what your irrational thoughts are. You are weaponless, defenseless against depression most of the time. But once you got to this stage, look at that first question. What is the rational truth in this situation? By this stage, you've trained the client to be able to take a step back in the situation and look at it through rational eyes, right? So, for example, if they were to say, "Oh, I think I'm worthless," what's the rational truth in that? Don't go with your feeling, don't go with emotion. Take a step back from that, right? Do you think you are worthless? And if they're trained to think rationally, they will go, "Well, no, because nobody's worthless. There isn't such a thing as a worthless human being, the same way there technically isn't a thing as an ugly human being," for example. It's all based on opinion, and my opinion is quite bad on myself, yes, but I am not actually a worthless human. What would those you trust tell you? What other beliefs would be more helpful to you? This is really, really good questioning from the made-up client, made up therapist, sorry, how would a logical approach lead you to act? So by this point, you almost got your client trained to think rationally, think sensibly, and not emotionally, to take emotion out of it. So the whole point is challenge irrational thoughts and correct them. As we said in the last video, you have automatic thoughts, you have intermediate thoughts, and you have core beliefs. And a lot of what CBT actually trains is all three of those levels, but it does want you to get hold of your automatic thoughts a little bit better. So as it says here, for example, we all have an automatic thinking process that we go through when faced by events, and we all do. If I were to give you your U grade mock exam back, you would have an automatic thinking. Now 19 out of 20 of you, I would comfortably say, would have a negative automatic thinking process. You go, oh shit, I've failed, or oh, this is useless, and you'd sit there and you'd be like, and you'll be maybe a bit upset, maybe a bit pissy kind of thing. 1 in 20 of you would respond to that and go, I haven't worked hard enough, I accept that, this is waking me up to the fact I need to get my head in gear, so therefore I'm going to get my head in gear. But if you're sat there like, oh, I failed, what's the point of trying? Why would you revise? Right, so how you think has an impact. Why would you revise if you think you're going to fail? So how you think has an impact on your behaviour. That's crucial, by the way. People with depressive... This is full of mistakes. People with depression have had their automatic thinking process gradually become more negative. That's probably quite key to the whole thing, actually, is that the slow process of someone's thinking slowly going downhill. There's two other things I do want to go through here. 2 or 3 other things I do want to go through in a bit more detail. So I want you to make sure you can specifically apply guided discovery, journaling, and the third one to depression in this case. So what is guided discovery? In guided discovery, the therapist will acquaint themselves with your viewpoint, right? So they will talk to you for a long period of time and try to understand you, have empathy. Empathy is really, really important here. Note that down. Empathy is really important in guided discovery, because in order for you to understand what somebody else is going through, you need to have good empathy. You need to be able to put yourself in their shoes. Then the last question's designed to challenge your belief and broaden your thinking. The client might be asked to give evidence that supports their assumptions, and they can't do it. So if someone says, I'm ugly, the therapist goes, okay, well, I'm not going to say, no, you're not. So you think you're ugly, right? Tell me why. Give me evidence that you are unattractive. And they go, well, so-and-so said so. Like, okay, but that's so-and-so's opinion, right? That's so-and-so's opinion that you're attractive. I wouldn't say that's evidence. Give me more evidence. And they just can't do it. Well, I think I am. Again, that's not evidence, is it? You're challenging them the whole time. Tell me why you're worthless. Oh, a teacher in year 3 said I was useless. Okay, well, useless and worthlessness are different things. Tell me why you're worthless. Well, I just don't think I'm like. Okay, but again, that's your opinion, isn't it? So you're constantly challenging them, confronting them, but not being aggressive about it. And this is why counselling is unbelievably skillful. So the client might be asked to give evidence, but they generally can't do that. In the process, they'll learn to see things from other perspectives, especially ones that they have not considered before. Sometimes it just takes a non-judgmental human to say, you are you, just be yourself. That's why therapy is quite useful. So that's guided discovery, right? Guided discovery is really the therapist trying to understand where the client has come from as much as possible. The other thing is journaling, and this is what I meant by the homework part. So the therapist may ask their clients to do a whole heap of things, by the way, but one of the things they may get them to do is to list negative thoughts that have occurred to them between the sessions, as well as positive thoughts. They may also, and this is also another good thing to note down, they may also try to get the client to identify any triggering events between the sessions that may trigger off a depressive episode. and get them to write it down. Get them to write it down. The other thing you may also want to do as well is literally get them to do a journal, to do a diary, and they can write in their diary, right? They can write in their diary, and they go through and they write it out, and maybe at the time they're depressed when they're writing it, right? And everyone hates me, and I really feel like there's no point in getting out tomorrow, and so on and so on and so forth, right? And then a couple of days later, they're in a better place, a more rational place, and they take this book to therapy, and they look at it and they go, "Oh my God, I can't believe I wrote that. I can't believe I wrote that." At the time, it made sense. At the time, it made sense to me. At the time, it was rational, but I feel quite embarrassed looking at it. That's why one way to describe this: you only ever think you are rational in the moment. Right now, everything I'm saying makes complete sense to me. Everything I'm thinking makes complete sense to me. But in a couple of days' time, I may be in a more rational place. But I can't, if I don't write it down. I can't. I can't remember what I said. So get your client to write down their negative thoughts, and then get them to read it again in a counselling session. As it says here, these largely irrational negative thoughts can then be showed to the client when they are in a more rational state. Fine. And then lastly, we've kind of talked about this already, role playing. So if I were to get you to do a 16 marker on CBT for depression, I would want to see role playing. I'd want to see guided discovery. I'd want to see journaling. I'd want to see, the whole point about CBT in general. Maybe the ABCDE model. So there's a hell of a lot you can talk about for your A1 here. Role playing can help you work through different behaviors for potentially difficult situations. So let me give an example that's not depression. A gambling addict walks down Shirley High Street past all of the gambling, slot machine places. That's a trigger. So what the therapist and the client will do is they will practice a role play for how they should think if they were walking down Shirley High Street. So, they will do that a couple of times. So you're training the client to be able to think rationally through the role play, because they've practiced how to think. The therapist can't go, if this happens, then just think that. See you later. See you next week. Right? They have to practice it several times before the client can actually do anything about it. So a couple of reasons as to why they'll do that, but role playing is quite important. So, evaluations. Firstly, does it work? Remember what I said for the treatment of phobias. Any treatment, the first question you have to ask yourself in terms of evaluating it, is it effective at treating the person? Does it actually work? And you have to have a statistic. So generally speaking, CBT or cognitive treatments as a whole, they are effective. So that's one point. However, everything I've gone through takes a hell of a lot of effort. Not being funny, but most teachers don't even want to. Most teenagers don't even want to admit they have a problem with their mental health. Even in today's woke society, most teenagers don't actually want to admit they have a problem, or certainly if they admit to it, they don't want to go get treatment for it. So, and even if they get treatment for it, they have to put a hell of a lot of effort in, because you are literally changing the way you think. And that is so embedded in you for the last 16, 17, 18, 19 years, or older if you're my age, that actually does take effort. So the problem you have with CBT is it does take a lot of effort. It's not like you can take a pill and it changes it. So it does take a lot of engagement, a lot of motivation, a lot of resilience and determination. And generally speaking, a two-pronged approach is always better. Mark my words, or take my advice, or whatever. If you know somebody who has depression, consistently, a two-pronged approach of counselling and medication is like medication in the short term to get you back to a place where you then can go to therapy, which is long term. That's what you should do. It's not a case of just popping pills your whole life. Medication is only supposed to be a short-term solution. It's only supposed to be a short-term solution, or initially it was. If you have both consistently, you have better outcomes. You have better prognosis. You treat the depression quicker and more permanently. The other thing that's probably quite useful as well, and this is a really, really important AO3 actually, if you take a drug for your depression, it only masks the symptoms. It doesn't actually tackle the cause. You still have depression the same way if I have a headache and I take a paracetamol, the headache goes, but I still have the reasons for the headache. I'm still dehydrated. I've still got candy shouting at me or whatever. CBT, on the other hand, it permanently treats the depression, but it has a plethora of other positive effects as well. Self-efficacy, I'm circling it, but you can't really see it. Self-efficacy, in my opinion, is the most important psychological characteristic of any individual. It is basically the belief that you can tackle anything that comes in your path. Sounds like confidence is not quite the same thing. Self-efficacy is having, like, just backing yourself constantly and having complete trust in yourself. That's a life goal. That is a life goal that most people never really achieve. Most people don't achieve healthy doses of self-efficacy. So if CBT helps that, that's brilliant. It also helps personal effectiveness, how good you are at things, and it also builds your self-esteem, another life goal as well. So CBT has loads of, I guess you could call them, positive side effects. So, is it effective? Yes. Here is an article I found from 2016. I literally just typed in effectiveness of CBT into Google, found the first thing. But this is Wiles et al. Over the course of 46 months, that's just short of 4 years, 43%, remember, you need a statistic for this. 43% of those who received CBT improved, reporting at least a 50% reduction in symptoms, compared to only 27% who continued kind of treating themselves, kind of thing. They didn't have CBT, they didn't have drugs, so on and so forth. So it does seem, if you compare 43% compared to 27%, CBT does actually have a increased amount of effectiveness over just normal kind of non-treatments. Now, what you could argue here, 43% is not even a majority. 43% is not even a majority. So you could say it is more effective than non-treatments or just medication. And that's true, by the way. CBT is more effective. But it's not effective for everyone. And that's where, anyway. A couple more points here. We'll just finish on this one. CBT is actually quite effective for the mildly and moderately depressed, but it does not work for people who are on the brink. It does not work for people who are so severely depressed or maybe suicidal, for example. How is that going to work? You cannot get someone who is feeling suicidal in on a CBT because it's just not going to work. So what you do is you give them the medication, the antidepressants, they're quicker, you get them into a better place, right? A more healthy place, less suicidal, and then they do the treatment. That is how you fix depression. You do not throw someone who is suicidal into CBT because it is just not going to work, and then they're not going to go back because they're going to think, well, I did CBT, it didn't work, right? Which is understandable, right? So it only really works for the mildly and moderately depressed. That's it. No model answer here. That went on quite long, and to be honest, I think it's, in my opinion, that was a shocking video. I wasn't really with it today. Either way, I hope it was useful. Just a quick reminder, and this is an important part to this bullet point. If you answer any questions on this, Your answer has to be in the context of depression. So you can't just say, oh, I don't know, the questions like outline CBT. You can't just go, oh, they're journaling, or they have guided discovery. You have to link the guided discovery to depression. You have to link the journaling to depression. So in this case, you'd say they would send them home with a journal or a diary to write about the depressive thoughts that they may have in between sessions. So you have to contextualize your answer to depression. Hope this is useful. I apologize for being all over the place. Peace out.